Hi guys, welcome to my channel, Women in History. You can call me E. Here I highlight a woman who has made a difference in her society, community, or history, whether that is for good or bad reasons. We are here to tell their story. Today we are going to be looking at the Kensington system and the early life of Queen Victoria. So, the Kensington system was a strict and elaborate set of rules intended to strengthen the power and position of the future Queen Victoria's mother. Essentially, these rules were intended to keep the future Queen Victoria weak, self doubting, and reliant upon her mother and her mother's attendant. So, when I first heard of this system, I immediately thought of Mother Gothel. Mother knows best. Listen to your mother. It's a scary world out there. But the system was actually instigated by Victoria's mother's attendant, Sir John Conroy, but she did readily agree to it. By all accounts, Victoria's mother did love her very much, but she was heavily influenced by those around her, which led to this controlling, strained relationship between the two. Now, before we get more into the system and what it was made of, let's sort out the key players because, quite honestly, European royalty is freaking confusing. Definitely from an American trying to understand this stuff. It's the worst. I can't believe people actually used to keep track of all this stuff manually and accurately too by like several generations. It's insane. But anyway, let's go. All right. So first we have the Duchess of Kent, whose name is also Victoria, although I think she pronounced it Victoire. Who was the mother of the future Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom. She was born a German princess in August of 1786. She was married twice, first to Emmerich Karl, Prince of Leiningen. After his death, she served as regent of the Principality of Leiningen during the minority of their son Karl until her second marriage in 1818. She then married Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, and Strathearn on July 11, 1818. Shortly after their marriage, the Kents moved to Germany, where the cost of living would be cheaper. Soon after they arrived, Victoire became pregnant, and the Duke and Duchess, determined to have their child born in England, raced back, arriving at Dover on April 23rd, 1819, at which point they moved into Kensington Palace, where Victoria gave birth to a daughter on May 24th, 1819, Princess Alexandrina Victoria of Kent, later Queen Victoria. An efficient organizer, Sir John Conroy, ensured the Kents' speedy return to England in time for the birth of their first child. Next, we have Sir John Conroy. Sir John Ponsonby Conroy, 1st Baronet, was a British Army officer who served as comptroller to the Duchess of Kent and her young daughter, Princess Victoria, the future Queen of the United Kingdom. Conroy was born in Wales to Irish parents. In 1817, after holding several ranks in the army, he became the equerry of Prince Edward, Duke of Kent and Strathearn. The Duke died 2 years later, unfortunately, leaving a widow and infant daughter. Holding the position of comptroller of the Duchess of Kent's household for the next 19 years, Conroy also acted as her confidant and political agent, among other roles. Together, they designed the Kensington system, an elaborate and strict system of rules for the upbringing of young Victoria, designed to render her weak-willed and utterly dependent upon them, in the hope of allowing them one day to wield power through her. Alexandrina Victoria, born May 24th, 1819, was Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland from June 20th, 1837 until her death in 1901. Her reign of 63 years and 216 days, which was longer than any of those of her predecessors, constituted the Victorian era. It was a period of industrial, political, scientific, and military change within the United Kingdom and was marked by a great expansion of the British Empire. For this video, though, however, we are focusing mainly on her early life under the Kensington system and only briefly looking at her reign. And last, we have the House of Hanover. The House of Hanover were a British royal house of German origin, descended from George Louis, Elector of Hanover, who succeeded to the British crown as George I in 1714. This dynasty provided six monarchs: George I, who reigned from 1714 to 27, George II, who reigned from 1727 to 60, George III, who reigned from 1760 to 1820, George IV, who reigned from 1820 to 1830, William IV, who reigned from 1830 to 1837, and Victoria, who reigned from 1837 to 1901. The House of Hanover was succeeded by the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, which was renamed in 1917 the House of Windsor, which is the house of the late Queen Elizabeth II. So this is the current house that is has the position in Great Britain. So with all that, that's all I'm going to get into as far as depth for these different monarchs, because again, European royalty gives me a serious headache, and that overview was the simplest I could reduce it to. And for the sake of a video, that's all we need to know. But if you're a true historian, like, you could be studying all these different houses and lineages like for years probably. So anyway, now that we know the players, let's move back to the Kensington system. Again, the Kensington system was a strict and elaborate set of rules designed by Victoire, Duchess of Kent, along with her attendant Sir John Conroy, concerning the upbringing of the Duchess's daughter, the future Queen Victoria. It is named after Kensington Palace in London, where they resided prior to Queen Victoria's ascension to the throne. The system was aimed at rendering the young Princess Victoria weak and dependent, and thus unlikely to adhere to her other relatives in the House of Hanover against her mother and Conroy. Some people believe a big reason why the Hanovers didn't like the Duchess of Kent was that she was very critical of the rest of the family. She thought they lacked morality. She didn't approve of the king having bastards outside of marriage. She was very intent on making sure young Victoria showed no signs of sexuality or promiscuity. They even thought the waltz was too scandalous for her to learn. Also, the rest of the Hanovers were also unpopular with the general public at the time for various reasons. And they wanted to be sure that there was some distance in people's mind, in the public's mind, between Victoria and her uncles. The young Victoria was never allowed to be apart from her mother, her tutor, or her governesses. Like never ever. She was kept isolated from other children and her mother and Conroy strictly monitored and recorded her every action and entirely controlled whom she was allowed to meet. So let's run down a few of the rules of the Kensington system that governed Queen Victoria's childhood. Number 1, Victoria was not allowed to spend time by herself, and she always had to sleep in her mother's room. Number 2, Victoria could not walk downstairs without holding the hand of an adult in case she fell. Now, this sounds melodramatic, but Victoria did actually confirm in later life that this was a rule she had to abide by. Number 3, Victoria was not allowed to meet any strangers or third parties without her governess being present. 4, the young Victoria had to write in a behavior book how well she behaved each day so that her mother could assess her progress. Sometimes it was good, sometimes very naughty. 5th, Victoria could only appear in public on carefully stage-managed publicity tours. This was to distance her from the unpopular regime of her uncles, Kings George IV and William IV, and to present her as the nation's hope. 6, Victoria was not allowed to dance the scandalous and intimate new dance called the waltz, not even with other royal relations. She would never waltz until married to Prince Albert. 7, Victoria had to build up her strength by exercising with her Indian clubs, a pair of bowling pin-shaped wooden clubs, and a machine with pulleys and weights, and was mandated to have plenty of fresh air. She would later be a lifelong devotee of open windows to the extent that her courtiers would always be shivering. Number 8, the young Victoria was not allowed to gorge on her food. She was allowed to eat bread with milk and plain roast mutton, and was restricted from eating her favorite things, such as sweetmeats and fruit. So, why and how was the Kensington system able to come about? Just as Queen Victoria's path to the throne was not obvious at the time of her birth, she was like the 6th grandchild of the king and the youngest. Her education and training for the position seemed to have been quite shockingly inadequate. One of the problems was the early loss of her father, the Duke of Kent. He had a lot of debts, so in the winter of 1819 to 1820, he tried to save money by taking his wife and baby daughter to live cheaply in a rented holiday house, out of season at Sidmouth in Devon. There he caught pneumonia and passed away. This left his wife widowed, the Duchess Victoire, in a difficult position. German and only recently married to her duke, she spoke no English and felt ostracized by the rest of the royal family. She had few resources, either financial or intellectual, on which to fall back for the care of her daughter. Her late husband's will also placed Victoire in an unusual situation. Normally, a child in the line of succession would be handed over to the reigning monarch for education and guardianship. But the Duke of Kent had loved and trusted his wife so much that he made her guardian of their daughter instead. This was a duty Victoire intended to see through, although the rest of the royal family would have probably preferred it if she'd slipped back off to native Germany. But she remained. The implication was that if her daughter came to the throne before she was 18, Victoire herself would become regent of Britain. She would effectively be reigning over a country which she could not even speak the language. Unfortunately, Victoire lacked confidence in herself. "I am not fit for my place. No, I am not," she would say. "I am just an old stupid goose." With these feelings of inadequacy, she would come greatly to rely on her late husband's adjutant from his army days, John Conroy. Conroy was a 6-foot, black haired, good looking chancer from an Irish background. It was Conroy, with his activity and capability, who arranged a loan for Victoire at Coutts Bank after being left penniless after her husband's death, with no help from the rest of the royal family. And Conroy could see, as the Duchess's chief advisor, that he might one day become the power behind the throne. He encouraged Victoire and the little Victoria to go back to live at Kensington Palace and there deride something called the system, the set of rules under which the princess would live. So, what exactly was the system intended to do? It sounds rather sinister, and on some levels, it was. At its most basic, the system was for the young Victoria's personal safety. It demanded she be kept in semi-seclusion at Kensington Palace. Behind the garden walls, she'd be isolated from both disease and assassination attempts. Secondly, the fact that she was rarely seen at court distanced her in people's minds from the unpopular regime of her uncles, Kings George and then William IV. As a possible future queen, she'd remain untainted by association with them. She would be a fresh start, or as Conroy put it, the nation's hope. But thirdly, and probably accurately sinisterly, the system also seems to have been about breaking Victoria's spirit and getting her to submit. It contained an element of surveillance. She wasn't allowed to sleep alone, play with other girls, or even walk downstairs without having someone holding her hand. And each day she had to write in her behavior book how she behaved. The first two components of the system were wildly successful. He did keep Victoria safe, and through a carefully stage-managed series of public appearances in her teenage years, he did manage to create an enormous groundswell of warmth for her from the people when eventually she became queen. One of the items on display in an exhibition at Kensington Palace is the small traveling bed that Victoria used for Conroy's countrywide publicity tours that he organized for her. Taking her on closely choreographed visits to provincial towns and noblemen's houses around Britain gave her future subjects an intriguing glimpse of their future monarch. It was a strategy that paid off entirely when, in the early hours of June 20th, 1837, the 18-year-old Victoria was woken up at Kensington Palace with news that her uncle had died in the night. She was able to emerge, as Conroy had planned, as a fresh start for the monarchy. However, she became the opposite of the weak-willed monarch he intended to create. Once she was queen, she would not long remain at Kensington Palace. She removed herself as quickly as she could to the relative freedom of Buckingham Palace instead. There's a well-known and compelling narrative that sees Victoria on her Ascension Day cutting free of the system to the extent even of changing her name. When called on to sign her name, the new queen put just plain Victoria, not the Alexandrina Victoria of her christening. It's widely believed that she was called Drina in childhood rather than Victoria, and that the change symbolized a break from the past. But her mother had some time earlier agreed that the Alexandrina should be dropped quietly, and her toys are marked with a V, so there is some dispute about that legend. So, how did the Kensington system affect Victoria during her reign? The system was not an entirely black and white affair. Even the most unpleasant part of it, that of the surveillance, was a benefit to Victoria. It toughened her up. She would have to face a lifetime of being watched and judged. The behavior books were just the start. As her mother explained to her, you cannot escape from the situation you are born in. Victoria might as well be given the chance to get used to living under watch and under pressure. This was far from the normal for a 19th century girl who was expected by society to shrink away from attention. But even Victoria's uncle, Leopold, an enemy of Conroy's, likewise coached his niece about the element of performance that would be so central to her as a constitutional monarch. High personages are a little like stage actors, he explained. They must always make efforts to please their public. Harsh judgment has sometimes been heaped upon the Duchess of Kent for not standing up to Conroy when he bullied Victoria. But while Victoire lacked moral fiber, that did not make her a bad person. And this too is something that Victoria herself in later life came to appreciate. As Victoire explained, she'd simply done her best for her daughter. My greatest of fears was that I loved her too much, she said. And what Victoire did bequeath to her daughter was a huge capacity for love. Most royals of the early 19th century could not afford to look for love in their marriages, which were pragmatic affairs undertaken for blood or politics. Yet Victoire, creature of an age in which romantic novels were beginning to provide a new template for living, had sought and found a soulmate in her husband, the Duke of Kent. She brought up her daughter to desire the same thing, and Queen Victoria's marriage to Prince Albert was indeed a love match. Victoria came in later life to realize the love her mother had felt for her, despite the system, and she also spent her childhood watching her mother defer so much to the advice of a man. The result of this was that she herself, in due course, would cling all the more closely to her own family. And in doing so, Queen Victoria would model for the media in the nation a domestic life that was more than acceptable to the age in which she lived. The Industrial Revolution had allowed a man working in industry or business to earn enough money to keep his wife at home, untroubled by the outside world. In her own family life, Victoria would become a kind of super Victorian, submissive to her husband, Prince Albert, and apparently devoted to her children. The perfect pinup for a populace tired of the debauchery, the mistresses, and the general excesses of previous kings. But while the young Victoria was loved to the extent of being spoiled, there were still terrible gaps in her more formal education. The system had given her nothing more than the standard education for a genteel young lady being prepared for marriage. The majority of her time was spent on music, drawing, at which she excelled, dancing, religion, French, and German. Her tutors reported her as indifferent at spelling, but good at most other subjects. The rest of her education, one of Victoria's prime ministers later noted, she owes to her own natural shrewdness and quickness. But there was also a curious advantage to having a queen who relied on her natural wit. It made her an instinctive, populist politician in a way that her classically educated male court and cabinet could never really appreciate. When she did ultimately come to write a book, for example, it was far from a learned tome. She published an account of holidays she'd taken in Scotland, which became a huge success and a runaway bestseller. Its rather banal content appealed directly to the people among her subjects who mattered, the people who held the balance of political power in the 19th century, the middle class. While other monarchies across Europe were being threatened by revolution, the British monarchy survived the 19th century unscathed. This was not least because middle classes thought that their undereducated, dutiful, home loving queen simply wasn't worth overthrowing. It was not the result that Conroy's strange system was intended to achieve. Victoria would look back on her Kensington childhood with horror and regret. But far from being the breaking of her, you could argue that Victoria's unusual childhood was in fact the making of her reign.